today we're just going to get through the introduction to this key concept 2.2. It's all about the development of states and empires. All right. So today we're just going through 2.2.1. All right. 2.2.1 deals with the number and the size of key states of this world growing dramatically bigger than what they were before, by overpowering and bringing into their own world weaker neighbors. But there's a couple terms that we want to make sure we are absolutely clear with as we run through the entirety of world history. So really today is going to be about talking about some of the ideas in regards to states and state building and state maintenance that will ride us throughout the entire year in AP World. First, let's just start with the word state, right? Now, we know a state today as like the state of Michigan or any one of 50 states in the United States. Throughout world history, we use the word state today, for example, to be interchangeable with country or nation. So let's kind of throw in here kind of country, nation. These things are the terms that we would use today. So the United States is a state of the world. The United States is a country in the world. The United States is a nation in the world. These things are all kind of interchangeable. But these two words weren't really used at all to represent the idea of a state up until the last couple centuries. Countries are new. Nations, the nation state, is a relatively new idea. Before we called them countries, these states countries or nations, we might have called them empires or kingdoms. Anyone want to take a stab at what the difference between a kingdom and a nation is? Or the kingdom and a country is? Yes. Okay. There's a king or there's no king. Sure. Now, you can be a country today, though, and still have a king. I want to... Whether you guys know too much about this yet, you certainly will by the end of the year. Before the 1800s, really before the United States existed, before the French Revolution in Europe, there really wasn't this idea of a country or a nation in the sense of it is a regional entity with some commonalities between citizens that live in it. That's kind of what we think of as a country or a nation today. Prior to that point, people lived in kingdoms. And when people lived in kingdoms, they didn't live as citizens of a kingdom. They lived as, what would we call them? Subjects of a king. Like they are subjected to the rule. This sounds like you're being dominated, right? You have no say in it. A citizen is comes from the Greek. It's just someone who lives in the city, right? Citizen has rights and responsibilities within a nation or a country. A subject is just ruled by their king. So this idea of a country or a nation is really new. Born with the United States as we broke away from our mother country, England. Born with the French. You guys might have heard over the weekend there's a little bit of controversy over the national anthem and what an American should or should not be doing when the national anthem is being performed at football games, right? You guys catch this, or were you finding a rock to hide under? National anthems are new. National anthems didn't exist before the 19th century. The French national anthem, you guys might be familiar with it? Where are my French students? Anybody? Is French running right now? Okay, there's no French. La Marseillaise, it's the French national anthem. It predates the American Star-Spangled Banner that would become our national anthem by more than a decade. That was the first national anthem. And the tricolor flag of the French Revolution really became the first national flag. Now, you might be familiar with like the Betsy Ross flag and some other flags that the United States had as symbols, but we didn't have one unified national flag symbol until a little bit later. So these ideas are relatively new, but the idea of a state isn't. So this is just a form of a state. Nation's just a form of state. Empires and kingdoms, they're just states. So when we use the word state in this class, please don't think Michigan, because AP World doesn't really care about Michigan or Illinois or Idaho. We think of the nation state, or a state as in like an empire or a kingdom. So that's what we're going to be talking about throughout this year, really. The most important development during this period of history, and note, what period of history are we in? Exactly. I can't think of the name that the College Board wants me to call this period of history. It's like expanding states and empires, blah, 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 blah. It's too wordy. So I'm going to stick with the old. The old, remember, was about 10,000 BCE to about 600 BCE. And we called that a pre-classical, right? Then you had this chunk going on to about 600 CE. And of course, if it's not pre, it is just very good. And then you had another chunk that goes to about 1450. And that is called post. It's really easy. It's so much easier than the new language that the College Board uses. This is what, like, if you take a university class and they're studying world history, these are the words that you will likely be using. So we got a post-classical. And then you got 1450 to about 1750, and that is a
Early modern.
Very good. The early modern era. We've talked about this already. Then to 1900, and it's oddly referred to as the long 19th century, because it's longer than 100 years. And then 20th century. So this is what we call periodization in world history. I like to think of it, and literally this just popped into my head today, and I think it's a good one, so I'm going to continue to run with it. I like to think of these now as bookshelves of historical events. All right? And historians don't want to they want to have their library organized. They want to have the story organized in their minds. So they like to associate things that have some commonalities. And obviously part of the commonality is chronology, right? It happened around the same time. They like to have them on the same bookshelf. So there's things that happened in the pre-classical era that we should associate with each other, like the Neolithic Revolution maybe being the biggest event. And then out of that coming the earliest civilizations and the earliest, what we would call city-states. These new states being born around new cities and the earliest urbanization, right? And then we move on to a classical period where those early states are going to grow dramatically or be replaced by even bigger states that will grow dramatically as they conquer further territories. So we, through our studies in this era, will come out with names like the Persian Empire, or the Han dynasty in China, or the Mauryan and Gupta dynasties in Rome, or the names like Alexander the Great. We're going to come up with a lot of these names that I want you guys to associate as being on the same bookshelf with each other. So when we get to the... Yes, ma'am, Jennifer. We will talk about that. A dynasty is just a word used for we use it in sports today. Anybody that's a sports fan, what's a current dynasty in sports today? Yes? You don't know? Okay, current dynasty in sports. Okay, let me define it and then you'll know what a dynasty is. A sports team that wins year in, year out. You know they're... Okay, in the NBA it's the Golden State Warriors. In the NFL it's the New England Patriots. These are dynasties. They've got some players that remain, right? But year after year after year, these are powerhouse teams. The New York Yankees, historically in the Major League Baseball, they've long been a dynasty, right? So these teams that are around for a while. A dynasty in world history is one family. Obviously, the ruler is going to eventually die, but then his son will rule. And then his son will rule, and then his son will rule. And if they rule for many generations, we call that a dynasty. They may or may not be an empire. That really depends on how much they're expanding during that time. So anyway, when we create these periods of world history, and this is known as periodization, to break it into more manageable compartments, then we can begin to associate the things that are similar to each other, things that are connected to each other in world history. Say hi, Miss Yoakum. You're on TV. So when we talk about the Mauryans or the Gupta or the Han or the Qin dynasty, we should associate them all together on this same classical bookshelf. And by the same token, as we get later in the year and we start talking about the advent of Islam in 622 as a starting point for us, as we talk about that, we'll note, well, that's on a new bookshelf. And there's things that we're connecting with Islam on that new bookshelf. But for the next few weeks, we're going to be living in this classical zone. Now, the word classical, for a classical period of history, this is a word that gets used in a lot of different arenas, right? Where else do you see classic or classical? Yes, ma'am, in the back. Natalia. Music. Okay, classical music. What do you think of when you think of classical music? Orchestras, these traditional instruments in an orchestra. Any names you would throw out at me? Yes. Beethoven, sure. Bach, Handel, Mozart. Okay, we got that. Where else do we see classic or classical? Classic rock. All right, classic rock in the late 1960s and into the 70s. What acts do you associate with that? Maybe the Beatles, at least the later Beatles, right? Anything else? Led Zeppelin, AC/DC. Sure. So we got classic rock. We've got classical music. Any other areas where we see the word classic popping in? Yeah.
Books and movies.
Okay, classic books and movies. Oh, very good. And these might be like classic works of literature, like, I don't know, Romeo and Juliet, sure. Or we might go to like Crime and Punishment or something from the 19th century. What do all these, the classic architecture, anybody familiar with that? Classic art or classic architecture?
Yeah.
What do you think of there?
They have not modern stuff. They're more like historical.
More historical, not as modern and as new, yes?
Good classical architecture would be like basically, they have like older houses and different countries like
Sure. We often see in like the pure sense of the word classical architecture, we'll see at the beginning of front of a building a bunch of columns, right? And it harkens back to the columns of ancient Greece a couple thousand years ago. And we might even call it neoclassical architecture. Like this is the new, it's modern, but it's remembering the old. So what do we use this word classic for then? Collectively, all these different things. Why is this word chosen? What differentiates something that is classic from something that is not? Yeah?
Something like old and popular.
Okay, it's old. It was probably popular in the sense that people like today look back to it as something good. Yes? Maybe it was originality, but I think a lot of like truly original things don't end up being classic because they never pick up in popularity. Maybe not for the time or even today. Yes, sir. It's a what? It's still in style. People look back to it and say, yeah, even though it's 2,000 years old, or even though that music is 40 years old, it's better than the stuff they're putting out today, right? Okay, so there's something that is still appreciated. I think something important, classical music, right? You guys kind of understand classical music, and if you ever see sheet music, any musicians in here? Okay, good handful of you there. If you see sheet music and the staff and the way notes are written, right? That was born with the original, what we would call today, classical musicians. And they created a convention that we still use to this day. Whether someone is in the United States playing music or someone is in China playing music, they look at the exact same sheet of music and they understand that language. So something was done back in the day that is now lived on and is replicated going forward. If you're into rock music, classic rock, like a kid gets a guitar and he wants to learn how to play Stairway to Heaven, because that's what you do to start to enter that world and start to understand that world and appreciate that world. With regard to architecture, and I know you guys in art, you guys hopped into art class last year, and she's teaching about these classic ideas that still exist in our world today. So there's something about the classic world that creates something that never really goes away and just becomes a foundation that everything else is built on going forward. And I think that's why world historians have long referred to this period as the classical age. Because the foundations of empires that will be built during this period, whether they be in China or in India or in the Mediterranean world or even in the Americas, become the civilizations that everything else is built on after. All right? Everything else that comes after builds on these guys. So today we're going to talk about all the different parts of the world that we will be dealing with in this classical age, and some common ideas that exist in all of them. So to start, The biggest development in this period, what makes the classical empire, or the classical period, is the empires that will be born and that will grow during this period, and conquering neighboring empires to grow larger than states had ever grown before. And now I've used this word empire a handful of times. We need to have a working definition of it. So empire. It's a large collection of people. You got to have a lot of people to be an empire. It's a large collection of people across a broad geographic area. So you've got to have a pretty large geographic tract of land that is yours. And they live under a common rule. They live under a common rule. We will refer to this throughout the year in our study this year as a centralized state or empire. Brief timeout. Whenever I say timeout, stop writing. And just hear this really quick. You don't necessarily need to write this down right now, but it's going to ride us throughout the year. Human history has been built ever since we started farming. We had the Neolithic Revolution and we started growing our food. Neolithic Revolution, the biggest impact of that is we created food surpluses, right? When we created food surpluses, it allowed some of us to not have to farm anymore. All we're doing, guys, is living at the final end of this Neolithic Revolution, right? If it started off where we started farming and some of us didn't have to farm anymore, we still farm. How do we get all of our food today? Someone's farming it, or some machine is farming it, right? But we've gotten to the point, at least in the Western modern world, where virtually none of us has to work on producing our food anymore. I look around the room, and if any of you or your families are producing food, it's a handful of tomatoes and a green pepper here and there. That's it. We don't produce most of the food we consume. We buy it from people that do. But we have fewer farmers and agricultural workers today in America than we have ever had. And we produce more food than we have ever produced. That's the end of the story of AP World, right? But the story from the beginning is if we produce more than we need, we can now have people that don't have to produce that food. What do we call this in world history? Where some people can do other jobs beyond farming. Yes? Okay, some become artisans. Yes. This is specialization of labor, where some might become artisans, and some become politicians, and some become warriors, and some become tax collectors, and some become scribes, they write, and some become priests. We begin to have many jobs. This all happened during the pre-classical era, right? And what we did is we grew food, and we allowed more people to work these jobs, but from the very beginning, when we were growing food and we created food surpluses, we had more than we could consume, right? You had to protect that food. Because there were other people out there that didn't have as much, and they would want to take it, right? And so you would have to protect it in one way or another. Maybe your society, from some of the taxes that they collected, might build a military. All right, might protect their food through some kind of army. Or maybe your king would draft a set of laws called Hammurabi's Code. And he would encourage people not to steal by threatening pretty severe punishments. You guys remember what would happen if you stole in Hammurabi's Babylon? Yeah. Yeah, you lose your hands if you stole. And that would dissuade people from stealing. Why don't we steal today? Okay, we've created a system of laws that say don't steal. We've also created a moral system, a moral code. For some of you, it's tied to your religion. Thou shalt not steal. That's why I shouldn't steal. For some of you, if you're not religious, you were taught from a young age, taking things that aren't yours isn't right, and you shouldn't be doing that. And if you do it, you should have Jiminy Cricket on your shoulder saying, "Oh, geez, Pinocchio, what are you doing?" Yeah, okay. So we always have tried to protect our stuff, right? To protect our stuff from people in our communities that might take it, to protect our stuff from other societies that might take it. And as time passed on, Societies sometimes grew bigger and larger, right? And maybe they created bigger armies that would protect their things. And they might be ruled in this state or empire by some centralized leader. And he might be a king or an emperor. Later in the year, we'll use the word sultan. Whatever we call him, you might have one guy or one family that's really calling the shots in this centralized state. One man, one leader, who is making the rules and making the laws, and people are following them. One centralized rule. But what happens if the family is not benevolent? The family is not good. They don't do a good job leading. They're maybe corrupt. And people stop following those rules, right? And if people stop following the rules or don't trust the central leader, they still might need their own stuff protected. So they might go to a neighbor or a local strongman, someone who can protect them more locally, right? And maybe they will agree to pay him some tax or something in order to protect his local stuff. So throughout world history, we have this conflict. At times, strong centralized rule means very weak local control. And at other times, when there's weak centralized rule, you have very powerful landlords, as we're going to call them throughout the year, and strong local control. Right? This debate, this balance between strong centralized rule and weak centralized rule is something that still lives with us today. Some Americans want a much stronger centralized government, while others would rather see more power in local governments. This debate is not going to disappear. During the classical age, these empires that we're going to talk about, they all have very strong centralized rule. But many of them do it in different ways. So they are a large collection of people across a broad geographic range. They live under a common rule. They've got some common characteristics. I'm going to put a line around one big empire during the classical period. You guys know what empire that would be? At its height? That'd be the Persian Empire. We're going to talk more about the Persian Empire in a couple days. But for today, let's just use the Persians as our example. Because we've already mentioned them, right? You guys recall talking about the Persians that came in and conquered the Neo-Babylonians, let the Jews go from their Jewish captivity or their Babylonian captivity, and they let them go back to their homeland to practice their religion as they saw fit, so long as they paid taxes and kept the peace. The Persians ruled what I like to call in this class a massive multi-ethnic empire. But within these massive multi-ethnic empires, we're going to have a lot of them through history, guys. We're going to have the Persians. We're going to have the empire of Alexander the Great and the Greeks. We're going to have a Roman Empire. We're going to have a Mongol Empire. We're going to have a lot of massive multi-ethnic empires throughout our class. There's commonalities that will exist through all of them. And here's the bonus of studying AP World History, as we've already experienced from our readings with Confucius. If you're taking statistics in math class for the first time, everything you hear about might be new. If you're taking physics for the first time, these might be new ideas that you've really never thought about. But when you take world history, you're learning about the history of mankind. And guess what you've been since you've been born? You've been a part of mankind. You've lived in a civilization. You get how the world works to some extent. So this is not going to blow your mind. Here's one thing that massive multi-ethnic empires do. They build roads. They build roads across their empire. They connect them. The Persians, we'll talk about this later, the Persians called theirs the Royal Road. Empires, states, build roads. Does your state today build? I'm not talking about United States, or Michigan. I'm talking about United States. Does your state build roads? Absolutely. And even without having had this class, you know why states build roads. The United States in the 1950s, you guys learned an APUSH, right? What did we do in the 1950s with regard to our roads? We made new roads. We made new infrastructure. What do we call that system that we built? The Interstate Highway system. Dwight Eisenhower in the 1950s. You guys recall talking about this last year? Maybe a little bit. Dwight Eisenhower in the United States Congress wanted to build modern highway infrastructure that connected every corner of our nation. Right? Today, you can get from Michigan to Florida on I-75. You can get from Detroit to Chicago on I-94. These are interstate highways. Why do they exist? What do they allow for? What do these roads allow us to do, Jay? Yeah, this is like not rocket science, right? It's easier to move from place to place. What kind of things are moving? Good. People are moving. Goods are moving from place to place. So it makes internal trade easier when you have a highway system. You guys might have heard with the hurricanes in Florida and in Texas over the last couple weeks. The interstate highway system allowed those people to do what? Leave, to evacuate an area. And in fact, going to the 1950s, part of the reason for creating an interstate highway system is it would allow for faster evacuation in light of a nuclear attack on the United States during the Cold War. So roads allow us to get out of a place if there's danger. That's why Puerto Rico is in such dire straits right now. Because when the entirety of Puerto Rico when the entire electrical grid in Puerto Rico is knocked out, there's no road that connects Puerto Rico to Florida, right? Everything that would have to get there to aid them has got to come over ship. That's going to be very difficult, right? And these are 4 million American citizens that are dealing with this. So roads allow internal transport for trade. Today they do that. For the Persians, they did that. Who else do you think can move on roads pretty easily? Religion, yeah. Now, they're not maybe built to spread religions, but religious missionaries will be moving over these roads, absolutely. And that's why when we talked about Rome and Christianity spreads on those Roman roads. And all roads lead to Rome, they said. Who else is going to be able to more easily move if there's roads? Yeah. Military, your army. And now we're, of course, talking about a time period where most of your soldiers were moving on foot. But having roads rather than muck to march through, it's going to be a lot easier to transport troops. So you can transport troops not only to defend your borders from outsiders, but maybe if there's riots or protests, you can put that down if you have an effective system of roads. So empires build roads. And this is going to link them all up. The Mongols, you don't know these words yet probably, or you're not as familiar with them. The Mongols are going to make the Silk Road trading routes better. The Inca, they're going to build a system of some of the longest roads that mankind has ever created in the mountains of Central America. Romans obviously build roads, and then modern civilizations do the same thing. These empires will levy taxes. They got to pay for these roads somehow, right? Pay for their military, so they're going to levy taxes on their subjected people. So as Persia grew and expanded and conquered new places, all they had to do was, the people had to agree, keep the peace, pay your taxes, and you are a part of this empire. You can live. They obviously created central and local governments to maintain order. And they built armies to defend themselves and maintain peace. So every empire that we're going to talk about throughout the year, whether they're the ones born during the classical period or the ones that will exist going forward, do these same things. Creating a government, collecting the taxes, building a military, creating infrastructure. Do we know that word? I know Adam brought it up. Infrastructure. This is like the backbone, the spine or the skeletal system of a society. Today it is our roads and our electrical grid and our plumbing system. Absolutely. Everything that Puerto Rico lacks now. Puerto Rico had its entire infrastructure system destroyed. So we're going to spend a lot of time talking about a lot of these empires through the course of the year. I'm going to lay out what are the big ones that we will be dealing with in this classical period that will be the foundational empires going forward. First, in East Asia. And you need to know these terms, these geographic terms. East Asia, in China, the Qin dynasty and the Han dynasty. We'll talk about them more in detail in a couple days. But the Qin, Q-I-N, in China is Qin. In fact, that's where the name China comes from. So the Qin dynasty and the Han dynasty in China. In Southwest Asia. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of Southwest Asia before. A couple of you? Yeah, this is new. Raise your hand if you've heard of the Middle East. Okay, everybody. The Middle East is Southwest Asia. Southwest Asia is the Middle East. Someone take a stab as to why world historians prefer to use Southwest Asia rather than the Middle East. Natalia.
It relates it more to the actual land area.
Very good. It relates it to the actual land that they're on. For example, if you're in the Middle East and someone tells you to look towards the Middle East, what would you have to do? You'd look down at your feet. And that doesn't really make any sense. Because east, wherever you are on the planet, is, well, what direction? Point east, everybody, right now. It's confusing, isn't it? It's that way. It's that way. Got to get your bearings, but east is that way. No matter where I'm at in the world, east is the same direction. So it doesn't make any sense for someone in the Middle East to have to look down. Why is the Middle East called the Middle East then?
Because
Adam.
isn't it east of Europe?
Yeah. So when the Europeans were dominating the world and making the maps that we now look at here with Greenwich, England, right in the middle of it, the Middle East was halfway between Europe and the Far East, which was East Asia. Middle East right in the middle, right? Does it make any sense if you're in India that the Middle East is to the west of you? That doesn't make any sense. So world historians use Southwest Asia. So we're going to talk about a classic empire of Southwest Asia called Persia. We're going to deal with the Persian Empire. In South Asia, we talked the other day how that is India, right, and Pakistan. We're going to deal with two dynasties called the Mauryans. The Mauryan and the Gupta. The Gupta dynasty and the Mauryan dynasty. We mentioned Ashoka last week. He was a Mauryan emperor. We're going to talk about the Mediterranean world. Mediterranean Sea literally means the between the earths, right? Between Europe and Africa is the Mediterranean Sea. We're going to talk about a few societies, civilizations, states, empires in the Mediterranean region. We're going to talk about briefly a group known as the Phoenicians. You might have come across them last year when you started studying this AP World stuff. The Phoenicians, not a very big civilization or empire, but gave us something really important. What did they give us? Yes, Miss Mary? The alphabet, a phonetic alphabet. In fact, the reason we associate phonetic and phone and Phoenicians together, the same language, is because the Phoenicians made an alphabet with symbols that were based on the sounds that we said. Whereas most other societies, like the Chinese, they had an alphabet, or script. It wasn't an alphabet, it was pictographic, where the symbols represented ideas. In our language, in our writing, based on the Phoenician, the symbols represent sounds. That's big. We're going to talk about the Phoenicians. We're going to talk about the Greeks. We're going to talk about the Romans. Guys, there's others. There's others. We just can't do it all in AP World. We don't have enough time. So this is really scratching the surface. But what's my goal in here? To get 5s. I'm not trying to get you guys 6s, because that doesn't happen. We're going to talk about Mesoamerica. Mesoamerica is Middle America. Mesoamerica. And a civilization based around a city called Teotihuacan. These are all on your standards if you're having issues with the spelling. Teotihuacan. A city-state that will predate and ultimately inspire some people you have heard of called the Mayans. Now, Teotihuacan and the Mayans, and then in South America, people called the Moche people, who predate the Incans. We'll talk about them much later in the year. These are classical civilizations that actually take place much later than these other parts of the world that we're going to be dealing with. Like the Mayans, they had their high point only around 900 to 1200. So they're much later. And part of that separation, why these things there might be some development coming later in time, is because unlike the rest of the world over here, and we can collectively call this, what do we call it all together? Even give me more. Afro-Eurasia. Afro-Eurasian societies, empires, all had contact with each other. The Romans were doing business with the Chinese. And when you have contact with each other, you're sharing ideas. Nobody outside of the Western Hemisphere had contact with this part of the world before 1492. So that contact didn't exist. Everything people in the Americas were doing, they did it in isolation. They didn't learn from others' ideas and build on it. All right? And they had very different tools to play with. For example, the Americans, and we'll talk about this going forward, they didn't have horses. They didn't have oxen. They didn't have any beasts of burden except for llamas. Think of Diego and the animals that you remember from Diego when you were a kid. That's what they have in Central and South America. So, as such, they didn't have a wheel. They didn't use. They had little tiny wheels on little tiny kids' toys that people have found. But they never grew it any bigger. Because what's the point of having a wheel on a cart if you don't have a big animal to pull that thing along? So there were no wheels in South America or Central America. And it sounds like you didn't come up with a wheel? It sounds so obvious. But remember, everything that we live with today seems quite obvious because it's already invented. It's the things that aren't in existence that don't seem obvious. Yes?
Isn't it because South America at this time is like the one half's in the Andes Mountains, the other half's in the Amazon rainforest? Where are you going to go with the wheels?
True, yeah. A lot of it's that is a great point. That's a great point. So, South America. We mentioned the Motu people. In North America, we've got a couple civilizations that are going to grow around city-states called Cahokia and Chaco. And there's many others, but again, these are the names that the College Board wants you guys to be familiar with. Obviously, when we're talking about size and power and wealth of empires, the bigger ones are in this side of the globe. But we want to acknowledge what's going on the West as well. Before we're done for the day, I want to talk about some major changes that are going to happen during this period from the earlier pre-classical age, and then some of the continuities that remain. First, the biggest changes that we will see is these civilizations will grow far bigger. Persia during the classical age is bigger than any Middle Eastern civilization or Southwest Asian civilization that ever came before it. They will all grow bigger. Rome, at the height of Rome, it will encompass completely the Mediterranean Sea. In fact, they begin to call it Mare Nostrum, our sea. And it goes all the way into England and conquers virtually all of Northern Europe and Eastern Europe today. So the Roman Empire grows to massive proportions. So they grow far bigger than they ever have before. This is in large part due to advancements in metalworking. Initially, the development of iron tools and weapons around 1500 BCE. And then later, other metals, bronze, and eventually the use of steel. This allows those societies that have the wealth and the ability to work with these metals to grow far more powerful than those that don't. And again, what happens when the guns and the steel of the Americas makes it to the traditional stone and wood tools and weapons of the Americas? They will overrun them. We would also see the development of cultures and civilizations in this classical age that leave legacies for every civilization coming after. To the point where today, people might build a neoclassical piece of architecture that looks just like something built in ancient Greece. Those are some changes. So new ideas that will go on compared to its previous time. But now continuities. AP World, we care a lot about continuities. What stays the same? Besides working with metals, the world doesn't change very much technologically. People farmed in the year 1000 in virtually the same way they're going to be farming 1000 BCE, in the same way they're going to be farming in 1000 CE. We don't change that much. You guys have probably in your lives experienced more technological advancement in your 15, 16 years than people experienced in centuries in the classical age. So some things stay the same. People's day-to-day lives were basically the same. You guys, we can't even, within your lifetimes, within probably the next 10 or 20 years, there won't be any cars or planes with people driving them or flying them anymore. We're going to all do it by computers and remotes. Yeah.
And they're going to be electric soon, too.
And it'll all be electric. So it'll be quiet. You won't hear cars revving their engines down the road. It'll just be all... It's going to be like the Jetsons, right? Okay, another continuity. And here is your catch-all continuity. On your AP exam, you might have to talk about continuities between societies, or different time periods. If you can't think of anything else to write, you can always write they're still patriarchies. Because they were patriarchies before, they're going to remain patriarchies through, and they're going to continue to be patriarchies after. We are living in the only society in human time, in human existence, where the patriarchy is starting to be chipped away by young ladies like you guys, right? And I wouldn't be surprised if the first female president is already approaching 35 or beyond and going to run next election. Some people started talking about Oprah last night. I guess she did a program, and now that we can only elect famous reality stars and TV stars, maybe she will be the next one. So the patriarchal systems will continue. They will persist. And like every society, they are building on some advancements of the previous. Remember Christianity we mentioned the other day, a new religion of this era? It really takes its cues from Judaism that came before.